This is a question from a former student of mine who reached out, and we had a little bit of an exchange. And his response to me was, "Thank God, my wife and I are doing well. We're expecting our first child before Pesach with God's help, with Hashem's help. Any advice, guidance, or direction would be kindly received." Well, your life is about to change forever. Getting married is a huge change because there's no vacation for marriage. Having children is in a significant way a bigger change because now you have responsibility for a little person that's incredibly dependent upon you, and there's no vacation from that either. I guess realistically the first thing that needs to be said is that it would be nice if we were all born grown up, mature, responsible, wise. Most of us learn on the job. Most of us develop our maturity and our wisdom and our work ethic even from life itself. Being responsible for a little life is going to frustrate you at times, but it's going to be usually educational. And in the end, what it's going to do is help you become a more grown-up human being, a more responsible human being, meaning focusing on what's really important and caring less and less about trivialities, including things that may seem very popular in the world. They're just simply going to be less important. A couple of thoughts in regard to your question. The first is, don't forget about your wife. She's your first responsibility. And I feel like if your wife were asking the question, I would say to her, don't forget about your husband. He's your first responsibility. I feel very deeply, and I feel that Apitoida, this is how it is. A couple is considered one person, and their ability to look after their children is predicated on their ability to look after one another and themselves. And like I always use the example of being on an airplane, and they always announce that if the pressure in the cabin will change, will drop, an oxygen mask will drop it from above your face, pull it towards yourself, put it over your nose and mouth, and strap it around and breathe normally. Air will be flowing even if the bag doesn't inflate, and then they say, put on your own mask before you help others. This means little children. And there's a simple reason for that. You can't help your children if you can't help yourself. And in a marriage, that means the couple, us. In the beginning, it's going to be very, very difficult. It's a funny thing, when you have your first child, everything is so much harder. And somehow when you have two, especially when you have three, somehow the extra work strangely gets easier. It's just funny. It's a strange kind of thing that happens. But your wife is going to have a baby. She's going to be physically exhausted. She probably won't admit it. That's what happens to young mothers in first deliveries. But she will need to rest, and you will have to look after her. And it's very, very important that you support your wife, not only love your baby in general and in this process in particular, which means pay attention to her physical limitations and support her when she is not able to do certain things, or even when things are difficult for her. And don't allow the birth of your child to interfere with your relationship with your wife. It's going to change it. It's going to change it hugely. You're not going to have as much time for one another. And as the kids get older, you can have less and less privacy. But it's always going to remain true that your wife is your first responsibility and your first, if I may use this word, your first loyalty. Don't forget that. Number two, our philosophy of child rearing is about Tahara and Kedusha, purity and holiness. Tahara and Kedusha begins before conception with Taharas HaMishpacha, and then when the babies are born, we put up Sher HaMalis on the door, as the Rebbe encouraged us to do. We take it to the hospital also, as the Rebbe suggested, the Rebbe encouraged. And then, of course, we want to surround our children with holy things, with images of kosher animals and of mitzvahs and so on. What I want to say is that oftentimes we become very, very, very precise about how we treat our newborns, but somehow when they get older, we forget that. Tahara Kedusha in a newborn doesn't end when they're 6 months old. It ends never. And in little people, the Tahara Kedusha shows itself in little ways, and in bigger people, the Tahara Kedusha shows itself in big ways. And when we set the course for our child rearing, we have to appreciate that as the kids get older, we need to make the necessary adaptations in ourselves and in our home to teach them and to give them holiness and purity in a way that is appropriate at all stages. Another thing which is very, very important to me and very near and dear to my heart, and that's the concept of chinuch. Chinuch means you have to raise your children, and you raise your children by showing them, and you raise your children by teaching them, and you raise your children by telling them. I find too often, especially young parents, they want the children to like them, and some of them have this terrible idea, I want my children to be my best friend. And somehow, child rearing means giving them whatever they want, making them feel very protected, and maybe giving them all the things you didn't have as a little child because you couldn't afford it. But none of that is child rearing, that's child spoiling. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but that's not child rearing. Child rearing is teaching. And teaching children the hard lessons, including the lessons they don't want to learn. Beginning, for example, with going to school. I'm skipping a lot of steps, but I'm using this as an example. The child doesn't want to go to school, he has to go to school. And once the child's in school, the child has to learn. And then when the kid gets a little bit bigger, the child goes to shul. Each one of these steps involve chinuch. And none of them are going to happen by themselves. Your child is not going to be what they're supposed to be just because they're around you and because they go to a Jewish school, or from school, a Yiddish school, or a Babich school. They need to be taught everything. And you need to insist on them learning the lessons of life and the lessons of Yiddishkeit. My constant in terms of chinuch is that if you tell your child anything at any point in his or her life, at the time that they need to do it, you're late. You're parents. So you can introduce your child to whatever it is you want them to learn a year before they need to hear it, 2 years before they need to hear it, so that by the time it becomes actionable, it's something that they're accustomed to, and it's been presented to them in a way that they don't become combative about it. For example, you don't come to a 9-year-old and say, okay, from now on you're going to shul. Or to a 10-year-old, from now you're going to listen to Kriyas HaTorah. You come to a 4-year-old and you say, when you'll be big, you go to shul. And you take the child to shul for a little while. When the child can't stay in shul any longer, the child goes home. And you introduce every step of chinuch to your child at a point when the child is open to hearing it because it's not yet practical. The same is true with girls and sneas. You don't introduce sneas to girls when the girls reach whatever age that sneas needs to be enforced. They hear about it before. And they hear about it in a beautiful way and in a positive way. So when they reach that age, they embrace it. And of course, that all works if the home supports the chinuch values that we give them. And in light of that, I just want to make one more point, which is the value of learning. Using and developing their minds. Kids go to school to learn. Now, learning is work. Learning is hard. In the younger grades, it's easier. And as the kids get older, it becomes more about them and less about what the teacher gives. The home needs to support the idea of learning and the learning itself. That the children know that you value how they do in school. And that as they get older, they have to work at doing well in school, at learning. It's not so much about getting a good mark. It is about learning, developing their minds. I cannot overstate how important it is for parents to let their children know that learning Torah is important to them. You don't need a reason to learn Torah. The reason you learn Torah is because Hashem gave it. And the more you know, the better. The more you learn, the better. It's a value that you must give the children. One final thing that I want to mention in light of this particular question, which I guess on some level I'm answering a little bit very quickly because each one of the points I just mentioned could be a segment unto itself, is that there are two environments that the most critical factor about those environments is they should be predictable and peaceful. Predictable means they're always the same, and peaceful means that they feel safe. And they're a home and a school. Neither a home nor a school is supposed to be a rah-rah environment. They're not places where you go to catch lightning in a bottle, to create magic. It's where you create normalcy and predictability and order. Because one of the foundations of emotional health is a sense of security and safety. And above all else, that's what the home gives. And of course, that translates practically in not being angry, not fighting with your wife, and all of those other obvious things that we all know are right and that we should do, or they're wrong and we shouldn't do, and yet many of us fail in those areas. Be that as it may, I'm not saying your name, but I wish you health and nachas and success and peace and bracha v'atzlacha.